Thank you so much for your time. So one of the first questions that I like to ask is, how did you get interested in paleontology and evolution?
So as a kid, I was always interested in science. So my parents, like, every time I had a new interest, they would support it. So, you know, one year I was interested in geology, they got me a rock hammer. One year I was interested in astronomy, they bought me a telescope. So I always had this passion for science. And when I went to school in New York City, there was this big museum, the American Museum of Natural History, right down the street from the school I went. And I volunteered with a curator there, and that curator invited me on an expedition. And I remember being on an expedition and just discovering and seeing this world of science where it's just exotic, and you know, it's people are exploring out in the unknown and finding new things in the rocks, and it just was infectious. So I decided this is what I want to do. So that's why I went.
So the paleontology was kind of a consequence of all these experiments
yeah,
that you had.
Yeah, the paleontology was a derivative of that. But one thing that really appealed to me most was that if you knew how to look, if you knew where to look, and if you could figure the puzzle out, you could find something that changes the way people think about a particular question. So for me, that was really big, because it was like, there's the intellectual piece, which is the puzzle to solve. There's the emotional piece, which is the joy of finding something or the disappointment of not finding something. And then there's sort of the aesthetic piece, where you find something that changes the way people think about themselves or about their world. And so to me, paleontology, evolution, anatomy had all that.
Great. So what do you think are the hot questions in the field right now?
Yeah, how did vertebrates come into being? How do creatures with a backbone come into being? Think about going from an invertebrate to a vertebrate.
It's a big change.
It's a big change. It's a big change in development. It's a big change in development in genes. It's a big change in anatomy and sensory structures and skeletons and so forth. So it's kind of a revolution in the way organisms are built and designed. You know, and there's still so many unknowns about how that happened. And I think there's a place where the right fossils, the right genetic analyses can fill some huge gaps in our knowledge. So that's one. But there are many. I mean, almost anywhere you look, there are wonderful puzzles. So that's the beautiful thing about science. It's always a quest into the unknown, you know. And yeah, so that's one area I think in the future I'll probably be looking at in a little bit more detail.
Really cool. So currently your work has several perspectives: research in the lab and in the field, teaching, and scientific outreach. Which proportion do they occupy your days, and which one do you prefer, if you could pick one?
I don't prefer any one, because they all feed back on each other. I couldn't communicate science unless I did the science, at least the way I do it. I couldn't teach like I do if I didn't do research as well. So for me, research is the beginning of everything. So, you know, confronting the unknown, trying to solve puzzles, trying to figure out the world around, trying to discover things, sometimes failing, sometimes succeeding. Being able to do that gives me the vehicle, gives me the means to be a better teacher, to be a better communicator. So in a sense, the research is sort of that fertilizer, the bulk of everything. You know, I could not give that up and be effective at these other aspects. That being said, each of those other things feeds back on the research. When I communicate science to students or colleagues, or in this context, it excites me. It excites me to return to the lab or return to the field. You know what I mean? So they're all of a piece. They're all sort of connected to each other.
And maybe brings you new questions back to the
That's right.
research.
I'll get a great question in a seminar, or I'll be stimulated by meeting a colleague or what have you. You know, so it all feeds off one another. So how much I'm doing at any given time depends on where I am in the time of the year. Some parts of the year I do more communication. Other parts of the year I do more research. It just all varies a lot.
Especially if you work in Antarctica, right?
Yeah,
you need to wait for the best weather conditions.
Right, and I sit in the tent for long days at a time.
Exactly. So as a teacher of medical students, what is the message that you wanted them to keep in mind? Because most of them will want to cure disease, but you have, as a teacher, what would be the message that you think it would be great that they would keep in mind?
Well, the deepest message, I think, is one that's important for all of us, not just medical scientists or clinicians, which is how deeply connected we are to the rest of life on our planet. We're connected to fruit flies. We're connected to worms. We're connected to yeast. And we leverage that when we do research on yeast, when we do research on flies, when we do research on fish. We're understanding about the human condition as well. You know, so I think we're so used to thinking of humans as special, and in many ways we are, obviously, for our abilities and things. But the reality is that to understand our fundamental biology, to make breakthroughs in diseases from cancers to Alzheimer's, we need to understand other creatures. There are models for understanding ourselves. And the only reason they're models for that is because we're so deeply connected to the rest of life on our planet. And the reason why we're so deeply connected to the rest of life on our planet is because of our evolutionary connection to them. And we see that through fossils. We see that through genes. We see that through development. That's the power of it all.
That's right. So how did you get the opportunity to develop a project like Your Inner Fish?
Your Inner Fish, the book and the TV show was really sort of a derivative of my teaching. You know, because I was teaching anatomy to undergraduates. I was teaching anatomy to college students and medical students. I was working in a museum talking to the general public. So I was talking about anatomy and evolution to many different audiences. And I found in talking to those different audiences, stories, scientific facts, ideas that were really compelling. So I tell people, you know, well, the bones you use to hear with, and the bones I'm using to talk to you with, many of them relate to gill bones in fish. I'd be like, what? So if you're writing science and if you're communicating science, that sort of what is perfect, because then it's like they don't believe it. Okay, let me show you. And then you show them the stunning facts that show these surprising connections. So as soon as I realized that there is sort of surprise in understanding anatomy, and there's surprise and satisfaction in seeing how he discovered that, that I realized, well, there's a story here. And then one thing led to another, and I started writing the book and did the TV show.
And what was the major challenge in this project?
Yeah, I mean, so the biggest challenge is how do you make something compelling, interesting, where somebody wants to turn a page? How do you tell stories, right? You think about when you watch a movie, when we read a book. Oftentimes, it's not the intellectual interest that keeps us going; it's an emotional connection. So, how do you create an emotional connection to dead fish?
Exactly.
All right, that's the puzzle. So how do you do that? Well, the way you do it is with stories of discovery, stories of people who discover the human element. Sometimes you have the puzzles that people are trying to solve. So solving that problem, that puzzle was important to me.
Really cool. And what would be, or you would like to be, your major contribution to paleontology and the evolution field?
Well, there's a couple. So one is I'd like to understand the tree of life a lot better. How the world got to the way it is. But also I'd like to inspire the next generation, right? I've done well if I've inspired other people to be better than me. So I'd like to be the best I can be, but I want to inspire younger people to be even better and to make further discoveries. And if you do that, you're successful.
Exactly. And you've been teaching, you're doing science outreach, so
yeah,
you're pursuing those goals.
It's all of a piece, yes.
Exactly. So thank you so much, Neil. It was a real pleasure,
My pleasure.
to hear about your stories.
Thank you.